Good evening, students. Take your places. The doors are closed, the stone above us is thick, and the lamps burn low in the vault beneath our library, where the dust of centuries settles not only on books, but on the silence between them. This evening, as the wind claws at the ivy-covered walls of Arkham, we gather to consider the fate of those who vanished not in myth, nor in metaphor, but in history. The 9th Roman Legion Hispana, once the pride of imperial strength, forged in the fires of Hispania, tested in Gaul, and blooded in the conquest of Britannia. And then, nothing. No surviving dispatch, no recorded death, no tomb, no triumph, no return. They marched north into Caledonia and did not come back. The official record grows quiet after a certain year, the dates thinning like mist across a moor. Some suggest they were transferred quietly, renamed, folded into other ranks. Others whisper of slaughter at the hands of tribal resistance, an ambush too humiliating to preserve in marble. And yet there are other stories, older ones, accounts of strange lights above the fir-covered hills, of low chanting in ruined places where no temple should stand, of legions swallowed not by battle, but by landscape, and by something deeper than landscape. We will tread carefully. Tonight's task is not to indulge the lurid, but to unearth the forgotten with the tools of scholarship, history, archaeology, and the long memory of stones. We begin with the rhythm of daily life, how the men of the 9th lived at the edge of empire, what they feared, what they left behind. Then we will trace their recorded path, step by vanishing step. We will examine the silences in Rome's bureaucratic tapestry, and at last we will reflect on what it means to be erased, not by death, but by design, or by dread. Before we proceed, check in with a like to mark your attendance, subscribe to attend future lectures, and leave your notes, your time, your location, or your reflections in the archive below. Now, close your eyes if you wish. Picture the grey hills of the north, heavy with fog. Somewhere out there, armor rusts where no birds sing, and the 9th still waits for orders that will never come. Let us begin. Imagine, if you will, the north of Britannia in the closing days of the 1st century, when the land was neither Roman nor wholly free, but suspended between conquest and defiance. It is dawn. Pale grey light filters through thick, rain-swollen clouds. In the distance, a dull horn echoes across the hills, followed by the clatter of iron against stone. The Roman camp awakens. Timber palisades creak in the wind, banners stir with the morning mist, and legionaries, dozens of them, rouse from their slumber upon straw-stuffed pallets inside their contubernia, the standard 8-man tents or barracks that housed the rank and file. These men were not aristocrats, nor scholars, nor sons of Rome's senatorial elite. They hailed from Hispania, Gaul, and the provinces, recruited young, trained hard, and promised land or gold at the end of their 25-year term. For most, this cold and sudden island was the only posting they had ever known, and for many, it would be the last. The fortresses in which they lived, such as Iboracum, the 9th known base, were laid out in precise, almost mathematical symmetry. Grid patterns of compacted earth and stone, with straight roads intersecting like nerves in the body of empire. Each fort contained granaries, a principia or headquarters, latrines, armories, and temples, small shrines to Mars, Minerva, or even to local gods whose names no longer grace the records. There were smithies, stables, and storehouses thick with the scent of dried grain and leather oil. The air always smelled of damp wood, old sweat, and the ever-present tang of iron. The soldiers rose with the light, though in the north that light was often weak and fleeting. Their first tasks were not glorious: cleaning gear, repairing cloaks, gathering firewood, scraping mildew from shield backs, feeding mules. Some prepared breakfast, a gruel of barley, perhaps a hunk of coarse bread, hard cheese, and watered wine, all consumed quickly before inspection. Meat, when available, was salted and tough. Luxuries were rare. Letters from home, rarer still. And then there were drills. The Roman military prized order, discipline, and relentless repetition. Shields were lifted and locked in formation, javelins thrown in unison. Practice swords, weighted heavier than the real thing, swung in endless arcs, even in rain, especially in rain. The roads of Britannia were slick and treacherous, its forests thick and close, and so the men trained in all conditions, and always there was the watch. Guards rotated through their shifts along the palisades and towers. They stood in silence as the winds howled from the north, watching the tree line, watching the sky. For it was not only the tribes the empire feared, but the unknown. There were stories, of course. Rumors passed in the dark, during dice games and quiet nights. Tales of patrols that vanished without a trace, of strange carvings in standing stones deep in the forest, of shapes in the mist, silent, slow, too large to be men, and of locals, those few who dared to speak Latin, warning that certain hills should never be climbed, that certain caves were older than the Druids themselves, and that there were names one did not say aloud. To a Roman ear, these were little more than rustic fables, superstition dressed in peat and moss. But even the most hardened centurion would admit, perhaps only to himself, that Britannia felt different. The cold reached deeper, the silence lasted longer. And some nights, when the wind shifted just so, it carried with it not the cry of an owl or the call of a wolf, but something else entirely. Still, life continued. Orders were followed, walls were repaired, roads were paved. Rome brought with it its gods, its weights and measures, its law and lash. But beneath the surface, beneath the ordered squares of stone and the Latin inscriptions chiseled in granite, there lay something unyielding, a rhythm older than empire. And perhaps the men of the 9th felt it too. At night, when the fires dimmed and the gates were barred, they would stare into the darkness beyond the camp, that blackness beyond the reach of torchlight. They spoke of home, of mothers and wives and farms never to be seen again. And always, beneath the laughter,
the grumbling, the casual bravado, there was the unspoken tension of being watched. For in the north, it was not the barbarians who stalked the camp's edge. It was the land itself.
The rhythms of a Roman soldier's day were as predictable as they were unrelenting, shaped not by whim or weather, but by order, repetition, and the unceasing expectations of command. In Britannia, where clouds thickened over stone and swamp, that rhythm took on a distinct texture: wet wool, muddy boots, and the bitter taste of chill wind against the teeth. Let us return, then, to Eboracum, modern-day York, fortress and headquarters of the 9th Legion. Here, the streets were stone-set and straight, the drains shallow but functional, and the walls thick enough to withstand both arrow and time. Inside those walls, soldiers lived in rows, slept in shifts, and moved in perfect formations, drilled into muscle and memory. They were up before first light and seldom idle. Between patrols and drills, there were endless tasks: cleaning helmets, oiling swords, tending to livestock, processing supply inventories. Each cohort had its duties, each century had its rota. There was little room for individuality within the ranks. Identity, like everything else, was forged in uniform. Leather belts studded with bronze, tunics dyed in dull reds, armor formed of segmental plates that clattered when the wind blew just right. Food was functional: barley gruel in the morning, lentils or chickpeas in the afternoon, often flavored only with vinegar or the brine of stored meat. Wine, imported, thin and watered, was issued more as ritual than reward. Bread was coarse and often hard enough to chip a tooth, especially after several days in storage. And yet, in these simple meals, camaraderie was formed. In the evenings, men would gather in small groups, dicing with stones or bones, gambling over salt, or reciting fragments of Virgil or local gossip. There were jokes, crude and clever, songs occasionally sung off-key. The soldiers of the 9th were not philosophers or poets, but they were men, and men build meaning in repetition. Some kept journals, though most were barely literate. Others carved symbols into the wooden walls of their barracks, names, crude likenesses, or sometimes unfamiliar symbols, local runes perhaps, copied from native stones they had passed on patrol. These marks were discouraged, but seldom punished. After all, men far from home often find strange ways of holding on to meaning, or staving off dread. Off-duty, those with coin visited the vicus, the civilian settlement just beyond the gates. Here merchants hawked salted fish, dyed cloth, and bronze trinkets. Here, too, were the taverns and the women, some Roman citizens, others native Britons or Gauls, many merely surviving in the shadow of empire. Transactions were quick and transactional. Bonds sometimes were formed, but no soldier was allowed to marry until discharge, officially. The locals regarded the soldiers with wary eyes. Some learned Latin for trade. Others learned Roman customs to curry favor. But many never forgot that their homes had been taken by spear, their tribes scattered, and their forests always watched. But be that as it may, the 9th endured. Through rain and frost, through hunger and illness, through loss and monotony, they continued to follow orders, build roads, and hold the line. They sharpened blades dulled by training, repaired armor dented by drill,
and stood watch on lonely towers long after their fingers had gone numb. They were Rome's outstretched arm, gripping a land that never quite fit in the fist. What they did not know, could not know, was that they were already beginning to disappear. Not in a single moment, not in one great calamity, but gradually, the ink of their records fading, the names on their rolls left unfinished, the footnotes thinning like breath in the cold. For history does not always erase with violence. Sometimes it simply forgets to turn the page.
There was among the soldiers of the 9th Legion an unspoken understanding, a thing learned not in drill or doctrine, but in the pause between orders, in the silence of the distant hills. It was the sense that Britannia was not entirely theirs, not even in the towns they paved, not in the forts they walled, not even in the temples they consecrated to the gods of Rome. Something remained, something older, something watching. The legions had brought their language, their architecture, their justice, and their gods. But culture does not always conquer as cleanly as armies. And in the land beyond the fortresses, beyond the network of Roman roads that sliced across hill and heath, the native world endured with quiet resolve. It would be wrong to speak of the Britons as if they were one people. The tribes of the north, Picts, Caledonii, Selgovae, were fractious, independent, and deeply rooted in their own local ways of life. Yet they shared a memory of conquest and a mythic relationship to the land. Where Romans built in straight lines, these tribes lived among curves, curved paths, circular hill forts, barrows that rolled with the hills. They told stories not in written words, but in symbols, carved into standing stones or whispered over fires, always out of reach of the Roman ear. And the soldiers of the 9th who patrolled these contested spaces could not help but feel the difference. They may have laughed at the Britons' rituals, at the painted faces, the chants in the woods, the carved idols left near streams, but in the deep of night, many began to wonder. For what Roman engineer could explain the silence that settled over certain valleys? Why did birds avoid certain groves? Why did the livestock cry out on moonless nights, as if sensing something even their masters could not? Superstition grew quietly in the cracks of discipline. Men carried talismans, some from home, others bartered from locals, a carved stone, a feather, a coin folded in cloth. Some muttered prayers to unknown gods before battle, hedging their bets, and more than one veteran had been seen tracing strange sigils on the wooden doorframe of his quarters, shapes not found in any Roman rite, nor in any official handbook. Centurions discouraged such things. Rome demanded uniformity. But command could only reach so far, and there were parts of Britannia where even a tribune would hesitate to order a march after sundown. The soldiers noticed how quickly mist pooled in low places, how shadows gathered earlier than expected. There were tales told softly, in jest, but told often, of pale figures glimpsed among the ruins of native shrines, of voices calling in Latin behind trees, only to fall silent when approached, of children who stared too long and spoke in tongues too old. One outpost sent a runner south with a message about drums heard at night, far beyond the patrol line. When reinforcements arrived, the outpost was empty. No signs of struggle, no broken gates, just extinguished torches, a few scattered belongings, and the deep, terrible stillness of abandonment. The report, of course, was buried. Such stories did not make it back to Rome. And yet there is evidence, small, persistent, and unnerving, that the ninth became uneasy. In the final years before their disappearance, there were subtle changes in behavior, increased requests for transfers, abnormal turnover in command, repeated maintenance of watchtowers that showed no signs of damage. Patrols began to deviate from established routes, avoiding certain valleys despite the strategic disadvantage. Official records speak only of disciplinary anomalies, but among the barracks graffiti and discarded letters, something bleeds through, a feeling of encroachment, of being slowly surrounded, not just by enemies, but by something else, something more ancient than Rome, something for which there were no orders. It is important to remember that most of the soldiers of the Ninth had never known another life. They had grown old in Britannia, in the rain and the wind, with only their brothers in arms for family. To live so long in a land that resisted their every advance, it could wear down the soul. And so many began to live between two worlds, outwardly Roman, armor gleaming, formation tight, orders obeyed, but inwardly something else, a creeping suspicion, a subtle abandonment of certainty, a hollow where confidence once stood. They no longer marched through Britannia. They moved within it, cautiously, like trespassers on sacred ground. And the land in turn seemed to listen. Trees leaned closer. Stones shifted slightly out of place. The fog rolled in thicker and lingered longer. They had not yet vanished, but something had already begun to erase them. Not with swords, with silence. The concept of frontier, to the Roman mind, was not merely geographical. It was philosophical, an idea etched into the very soul of empire. Beyond the frontier lay chaos. Within there was order, measured roads, counted men, named gods. And yet, in Britannia, the frontier was not a wall or a river. It was a feeling, mutable, uncertain, and forever just a little farther than where you stood. At Eboracum, the 9th Legion had long served as the northernmost anchor of British Britain. Their fortifications were strong, their roads patrolled, their scouts disciplined. But all of it, every outpost, every mile marker, was built on contested ground. They were not holding a line, they were holding a breath. And the farther north they marched, the more that breath trembled. Long before Hadrian's Wall would take shape in stone, there was already a conceptual barrier, one drawn not on maps, but in the minds of men. South of that invisible line, there was Roman law, enforced with steel and ceremony. North of it, there were hills unnamed and forests unmeasured. Beyond that line the land did not behave. It was a place of stillness, not the calm of peace, but the kind of stillness that warns of something watching. There are surviving letters copied onto wax tablets from soldiers stationed in northern forts like Vindulanda. Some complain of shortages or request warmer cloaks. Others describe patrols that failed to return. One, unsigned, mentions a storm that never moved, a darkness that hovered over a hilltop for 3 days. Whether this was weather, fear, or embellishment, we cannot say, but it is there, a shadow in the record. The Ninth knew that they stood between Rome and something else. They wore that knowledge like a second cuirass, heavy, suffocating, necessary. It is worth considering, too, the strange permanence of impermanence in their world. Though they lived in forts, many soldiers had no expectation of growing old in them. The average recruit hoped for survival, not comfort. Each tour of duty was one more dice throw, and in Britannia the dice were often cold to the touch. Many would be sent to man temporary camps far from the central roads, isolated and nearly forgotten. These marching forts were erected quickly, occupied for weeks or months, then abandoned without ceremony. A ditch here, a row of post holes there. These are the only remains archaeologists can now find. The Ninth's footprints were always shallow, always in soil that refused to keep them. What did they whisper to one another in those lonely places? What did they see beyond the firelight? There are stories, local ones, of figures glimpsed in ranks along hilltops long after the legion had disappeared from the record. Travelers speak of hearing boots in the night, rhythmic and precise, passing by unseen, of campsites found empty, yet with embers still warm. The old Roman roads, now grown over, are said to hum faintly under certain phases of the moon. Perhaps it is merely the wind, or perhaps some roads are never truly empty. But of course, we must return to history. What we know is that sometime in the early years of the 2nd century, perhaps during the reign of Trajan, perhaps just after, a detachment of the 9th Legion was ordered north. Their destination is unclear. The record ends not with a flourish, but with a fading. Fewer inscriptions, fewer promotions, no grand memorials, just the slow, almost deliberate falling away of names. It is here, at the edge of segment 1, that we pause. For these soldiers, whose lives were a blur of frost-bitten drills, sour wine, dull rations, and endless watches, were never given an ending. Their families never received letters. Their comrades never told their stories. Their commanders never recorded their final march. And yet in the stones they laid, in the roads that still stretch across northern England, in the strange silences of certain valleys, something remains. Not memory, not legacy, but presence, a quiet, unanswered presence, humming beneath the moss. We must first understand what was lost to understand what was made. The 9th Legion, Hispana, Legio non Hispana, was not born in Britain, nor even in the mists of the north. Its origins stretch back to the crumbling years of the Roman Republic, perhaps as early as the campaigns of Julius Caesar himself. Though its founding is shrouded in contradictions of ancient sources, it likely began as a unit under Caesar during the Gallic Wars in the mid-1st century before the Common Era. In those blooded fields and bitter forests, the Ninth was formed, not merely as a fighting force, but as an idea of Rome's iron will stretched to the edges of the map. Its early designation, Hispana, was earned in the campaigns against the Cantabri and Astures in the mountains of northern Hispania, where the legion fought under Augustus during the long and brutal subjugation of the Iberian Peninsula. These were not glorious battles of swift victory. They were drawn-out struggles against guerrilla resistance, with attrition rather than conquest as the defining shape of the campaign. There, in the rocky passes and cold ravines of Hispania, the Ninth developed its reputation for endurance. Its soldiers were known for their ability to hold ground under impossible conditions, to march farther, fight longer, and outlast the enemy through sheer resolve. That trait would define them in the decades to come. By the early years of the Common Era, the Ninth had been moved northward, participating in the suppression of revolts and the maintenance of Roman control in Gaul. But it would be under Emperor Claudius that the Ninth marched into its most storied and most fateful posting. In the year 43 of the Common Era, Claudius ordered the invasion of Britannia. The island had long existed as a tempting but unconquered territory in Rome's sphere of influence, known for its tin, its cattle, and its defiant tribes. The Ninth was among the 4 legions selected to accompany Aulus Plautius, the general tasked with leading the invasion. Crossing the Channel, the Ninth landed on foreign soil once more, bearing the standard of Rome into a land that would never fully accept it. Their early campaigns in Britannia were brutal but successful. The Ninth helped secure key river crossings, pushed through native resistance, and constructed fortresses along strategic corridors. As Rome tightened its grip on southern and eastern Britannia, the Ninth was among the primary tools of that control. They did not merely fight, they built forts, roads, supply depots. The bones of Roman Britain were laid, in large part, by their hands. But the island was not quiet for long. In the year 61, the great revolt of Boudica erupted. The queen of the Iceni tribe led an uprising that razed Roman settlements, including the infamous destruction of Londinium. It was during this rebellion that the Ninth suffered its first great wound. Under the command of a certain Petilius Cerialis, the Ninth attempted to intercept Boudica's forces. What occurred was a disaster. Their infantry was annihilated in an ambush, their standards taken, their pride trampled into the bloodied soil. Only the cavalry survived, retreating in disarray. It was a humiliation, not a fatal one, but one that scarred the legion's identity for the remainder of their service in Britannia. The decades that followed saw them stationed primarily at Lindum, modern-day Lincoln, and later at Eboracum, establishing the northern frontier of Roman control. Their duties were multifold: policing local populations, constructing infrastructure, and expanding into increasingly hostile northern territory. This was not the glamorous warfare of Caesar's memoirs. It was attritional, exhausting, and deeply psychological. The tribes of Caledonia, farther north, were fierce and mobile.
They refused to meet the Romans in pitched battle, instead melting into the wilderness, striking from cover and vanishing. The Ninth found itself fighting not armies, but landscapes, mud, mist, stone, and silence. Still, they held the line. They built forts of timber and stone. They bridged rivers with Roman engineering. They carried out punitive expeditions deep into enemy territory. They endured as they always had. But something was changing. In the first years of the 2nd century, under the rule of Emperor Trajan, the Ninth began to fade from the record. Not all at once. At first, it is simply a matter of silence. Fewer inscriptions, fewer honors, a quieting of the bureaucratic drum that usually accompanied any legion's activity. Their standard was last definitively seen at Eboracum. After that, only fragments remain. A tile here, a grave there. The name appears less frequently. Promotions go unrecorded. Transfers to and from the legion dry up. No final campaign is listed. No decisive defeat is written. They do not end. They stop. And in history, a silence that deliberate often hides something far deeper than mere forgetfulness. What we are left with, then, is not a tale of battle or glory, but of absence. The first act of the Ninth story ends not with a climax, but with a fade, one so gradual that even Rome may not have noticed it was happening at all. And perhaps that was the intention. Or perhaps it was not Rome that forgot the Ninth.
In the long corridors of imperial memory, some legions are inscribed in triumph, others vanish into shadow. After decades of hardened service in the cold frontier of Britannia, the Ninth Legion stands, by the early years of the 2nd century, at a crossroads, both literally and metaphorically. Rome's hold on the island was secure in the south, but the north remained elusive. Eboracum was now their base of operations, and from there they launched periodic expeditions into Caledonia, the land of shadowed glens and silent hills, home to tribes who did not yield and did not forget. And then the record begins to fade. The last datable inscription explicitly referencing Legio IX Hispana in Britain comes from Eboracum around the early years of the 2nd century, perhaps near the year 108. It is not a dramatic farewell, no battlefield epigraph, no marble cenotaph, merely a building stone bearing their name, marking construction work on a barracks or wall, the sort of inscription carved by a stonemason who never imagined he was setting down the final Roman trace of a legion. And from that moment on, silence. Not abrupt, but unmistakable. No further inscriptions, no further deployments, no mention in military diplomas, no promotion lists, no commendations. It is not the silence of a battle lost, it is the silence of disappearance, eerily thorough, as if their very paperwork had been untenned. So what happened? The traditional theory, once broadly accepted, is that the Ninth was sent north in one final campaign, tasked with pacifying the increasingly hostile tribes beyond Eboracum. This was not uncommon. Imperial policy relied on frequent shows of force to prevent uprisings. And if that was their mission, then it is possible, some have claimed even likely, that they were ambushed, overwhelmed, and destroyed in some cold and forgotten valley north of the wall that did not yet exist. But there are problems with this view. Rome was bureaucratic to a fault. Even legions that suffered devastating losses were not forgotten. Legio 17, 18, and 19, annihilated in the Teutoburg forest under Varus in the year 9, were struck from the rolls but not erased. Their memory lived on in infamy. Augustus mourned them. Statues were raised in contrition. The field where they died was later reclaimed and consecrated. Rome did not hide its shame. It documented it. The 9th, by contrast, simply ceases. There are alternative theories. One posits that the 9th was quietly transferred out of Britain, perhaps to the Rhine frontier, perhaps to the eastern provinces. Some inscriptions found in Nijmegen, in what is now the Netherlands, have been linked to members of the 9th, though the evidence is tenuous. A tile stamp here, a burial marker there, enough to provoke curiosity, but not consensus. Another theory suggests that the 9th was disbanded, not destroyed, that after years of underperformance, losses, or internal disorder, the legion was absorbed into other units. Legions were sometimes amalgamated, particularly when a unit had suffered a loss of prestige. Its men would be reassigned, its name quietly retired. This would explain the lack of fanfare, the absence of a final battle, the administrative vanishing. And yet, this explanation, while plausible, feels unsatisfying. It accounts for the logistics, but not the atmosphere. It provides a cause, but not a mood. For there is something about the 9th's absence that feels different. It is not a matter of military protocol. It is haunting. Consider the geography. If the 9th did vanish in Caledonia, their final march would have taken them into terrain unlike any they had seen before, into high moors blanketed with fog, through forests tangled with ancient yews and bogs that swallowed weight without trace. They would have crossed paths once trod only by druids, up into hills dotted with standing stones, whose meanings were already lost in their time. There are no Roman forts beyond a certain point, no long-term encampments, just faint traces, rectilinear outlines barely visible to modern satellites. They were there, and then they were not. Some archaeologists believe that the very absence of evidence is evidence of a failed campaign, one so disastrous that nothing could be salvaged. But perhaps the greater failure lies in what Rome chose not to say. The empire, which wrote everything, wrote nothing of the 9th's end. And it is in that void that speculation grows. One might imagine the last days of the 9th as a slow erosion of cohesion, marching further into the highlands, finding no settlements, only traces, abandoned fires, bloodless totems, carved warnings in a language even the auxiliaries could not read. And then the vanishing. Not a single moment of battle, but a gradual breakdown. Patrols that did not return, scouts who walked into fog and never reappeared, supply lines severed not by violence, but by removal. By the time Rome noticed, there was nothing to retrieve. Or perhaps they did notice and chose
to forget. There is an old saying lost among the soldiers' graffiti, "Que silent manent." What is silent remains. Perhaps that was the final truth of the 9th. Not a defeat, not a retirement, but an absorption into the silence of the North. The Legion did not fall. It was taken.
By now, the facts are laid bare before us, sparse though they may be. A once proud Roman legion, documented, decorated, and long stationed in Britannia, fades from the imperial ledger sometime in the early 2nd century. And into that space historians have poured theories, some tidy, others troubling. The most enduring theory, one taught for much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, is that the 9th was annihilated in the north, that sometime around the year 117 they marched into Caledonia and suffered total defeat at the hands of the tribes. The silence in the record, in this view, is not mysterious, but bureaucratic, a result of shame or suppression. And it is not impossible. The Caledonian tribes were fiercely resistant to Roman encroachment. They did not fight as the legions preferred. No lines of infantry, no cavalry charges across open plains. Their war was one of patience and terrain. Spears from the trees, traps in the underbrush, fires lit at night without any hand in sight. The 9th, though experienced, may have been under strength, fatigued by years of posting in the frontier. A well-planned ambush in the dense highlands could have decimated them, especially if relief was delayed or unavailable. The fog, after all, was as much a weapon as the spear. But the problem remains. Rome recorded even its failures. Catastrophes, when they came, were inscribed on marble, carved into monuments, spun into lessons for future generations. The Teutoburg disaster was a national trauma. Even distant battles in Armenia or Numidia were meticulously logged. Why then, if the 9th was destroyed, was no such account left? This opens the door to a second theory, one that sits more comfortably with Rome's bureaucratic habits. In this version, the 9th was not destroyed, but quietly transferred. Some suggest the legion was sent to the continent to reinforce the Rhine frontier, or to bolster garrisons in Germania or Dacia. A few inscriptions found at Nijmegen and some scattered references in later texts seem to support this. A tile stamped with the mark of the 9th, a tombstone bearing the name of a soldier once listed on the British rolls, compelling perhaps, but not conclusive. These may represent veterans, individuals who had once served in the 9th before transferring elsewhere, or they may reflect clerical errors, misattributions, or reused designations, common enough in the Roman world. And still, the core question remains unanswered. Why does the 9th not appear on any official lists after this period? The Notitis Dignitatum, a register of imperial forces compiled later, omits them. There is no clear record of their formal disbandment, no reassignment under a new name that scholars can trace with confidence. A third theory posits that the legion, suffering from attrition and poor morale, was gradually dissolved, its members redistributed among other units, its standard quietly retired, its shameful name erased by an empire that valued appearances. In this version, there is no final battle, no glorious defeat, just a slow, forgetful death, a paperwork disappearance. And yet, even this feels incomplete. A legion is not so easily undone. Standards must be accounted for, banners handed over, pay ledgers balanced. The machinery of Rome was slow but thorough. Its silences are rare, and therefore all the more suspect. There are also stranger whispers, not within the realm of accepted scholarship, of course, but in the margins of old manuscripts, in regional folklore passed down in hushed tones. In those stories, the ninth did not die. It crossed, not into death, but into something else. One tale, recorded by a Christian monk centuries later, tells of a column of men in red, with iron faces, seen into the northern fog, never breaking rank, never speaking, their torches never dimming. Another, from a Gaelic oral tradition, speaks of a stone serpent that swallowed whole 100 warriors, leaving behind only their shadows. These stories do not align, and they do not clarify. But they speak to the same absence, one so profound that it became myth. Modern scholars, of course, dismiss such accounts, and rightly so. We must proceed with care and evidence. But here at Miskatonic, we are permitted occasionally to ponder the shape of what is not found. The void left by the ninth is strangely complete, too complete, as if sand were swept carefully over their footprints, as if memory itself was smoothed clean. If they were destroyed, where is their monument? If they were reassigned, where is their paperwork? If they were dissolved, where are the whispers of the men who once served within them? A final theory, rarely spoken aloud in academic circles, but persistent nonetheless, is that the ninth encountered not an enemy, but a boundary, one not drawn on maps or maintained by Rome, a threshold of place or of perception, something older than empire, something that required no sword. Not all disappearances are violent. Some are consuming. And the men of the ninth, for all their training, may have crossed a line not meant to be crossed. It is a peculiar irony that the Roman Empire, famed for its records, its monuments, and its vast bureaucratic infrastructure, may have buried the ninth not in earth or blood, but in silence. For Rome was not only a military power, it was a system of documentation. Every man had a place on the scroll. Every officer had his lineage, his postings, his honors recorded. Legionary movements were copied to tablets, then transcribed into ledgers, then passed on to governors, to emperors, to the eternal marble of public remembrance. And yet, there is no definitive account of the end of Legio IX Hispana. Not in the Res Gestae, not in Tacitus, who chronicled other disasters with solemn precision, not in Cassius Dio, who named and numbered defeats, not even in the military diplomas issued to discharged veterans, where the ninth's name simply ceases to appear. It is as though the legion was excised, not lost, but removed. To understand how this could occur, we must consider the mindset of imperial Rome. The empire was vast, but its authority was fragile. Revolts, defeats, logistical failures, these were not just military events. They were threats to the illusion of Roman permanence. And the farther one traveled from the marble forums of the capital, the more tenuous that illusion became. Britannia, to the men in the Senate, was not a prize, but a nuisance. An island of bogs and moors, forever requiring soldiers, never yielding profit. Its conquest was more symbolic than strategic. Its tribes refused Romanization. Its climate spoiled crops and swords. To lose a legion there might not have seemed worth recording, especially if the loss was unconventional. If the ninth met its end not in a glorious final stand, but in attrition, ambush, or inexplicable disappearance, Rome may have simply opted to let the silence stand. Easier, perhaps, to allow time to erase the problem than to admit it had occurred. Such omissions were not unknown. History, even in Rome, was written by victors, and when the victors were uncertain, the ink often dried too quickly. There may also have been political motives. At the time of the ninth's fading, Emperor Trajan was engaged in grand campaigns in Dacia, conflicts that brought glory, spoils, and propaganda. His public image was that of the conquering emperor, the new Augustus. A mysterious setback in the fog-shrouded north of Britannia would have been inconvenient at best, embarrassing at worst. What better way to preserve the image of control than to redact the flaw entirely? In the generations that followed, the silence hardened into structure. When Hadrian succeeded Trajan, he famously ordered the construction of the wall that would divide the empire from the wilds to the north. Hadrian's wall, begun in the year 122, marked a shift in policy, from expansion to consolidation, from conquest to containment. Was this response to the loss of the ninth? Perhaps, perhaps not. The chronology is suggestive, but not definitive. Yet it is difficult to ignore the symbolism. A wall was raised, a border declared, a line drawn across the island, as if to say, here and no farther. It is also worth noting that Hadrian was known for administrative reform. If the ninth had been depleted, scattered, or disgraced, his regime may have opted to disband it quietly, redistributing its remaining assets to other legions and allowing the name to fall from use. And then it was gone. It did not reappear in the later Notitia Dignitatem. It was not revived by the Severan emperors, nor invoked by later historians. Its memory faded faster than those of legions lost in more distant corners of the world. The stone goes quiet. The scroll curls in on itself. And in that absence, we are left with unsettling questions. Is it possible for an entire body of men, thousands, trained, armed, bound by oath, to vanish from the historical record without cause? Or did the cause lie not in what was done, but in what could not be said? The ninth may have been more than lost. They may have been unmade, not physically, but bureaucratically. A decision made in a marble hall, a name struck from a ledger, a silence imposed not by death, but by decree. For even in empire, memory is not a matter of fact, it is a matter of will. And what Rome chose not to remember, the world would be allowed not to know. Long after the parchment fades and the scribes grow still, the earth continues to whisper, quietly, persistently, in stones worn by wind, in timbers preserved in clay, in fragments of inscription half swallowed by moss. And so we turn now from the histories, those meticulous, incomplete records of empire, to the more honest narrative of the soil. For centuries, the question of the Ninth Legion's fate has drawn not only historians, but excavators, surveyors, and seekers of traces. If the scrolls have failed us, perhaps the ground beneath our feet will not. Our journey begins at Eboracum, modern-day York, where the Ninth was last officially stationed. Here, beneath layers of medieval and modern stone, Roman foundations remain. Archaeologists have uncovered the outlines of barracks, the baths, the Principia, central to any Roman fortress, and notably several stone inscriptions bearing the unmistakable mark of Legio Naina Hispana. One such inscription, dated approximately to the early 2nd century, commemorates construction undertaken by the legion. The Latin is blunt and formulaic, a line of command, a declaration of completion. But it is the last of its kind. No further stones bearing their name appear after that point, not in York, not anywhere. In Roman military tradition, legions left their mark wherever they went, in tile stamps, dedications, gravestones. But the Ninth, after that final matter-of-fact carving, vanishes from the physical record just as it does from the written one. There are, however, subtler traces. Fragments of tile stamped with Legio Naina HSP have been found as far south as Lincoln and as far north as Catterick. These may suggest movements, resupply routes, or the routine dispersal of legionary detachments, but they tell us nothing about the legion's fate. If anything, they emphasize the normalcy of their presence before the fall, like footprints that simply stop mid-stride. There is also the matter of Vindolanda. This fort, located just south of where Hadrian's Wall would later be constructed, is one of the richest archaeological sites in Roman Britain. Here, preserved beneath the oxygen-starved soil, lie wooden tablets, letters, lists, inventories, written in ink and frozen in time. Some of these documents date to the very window in which the Ninth disappears. They reference supply shortages, military tensions, a persistent unease on the frontier, but the Ninth itself is not mentioned at all. Their absence here, too, is a presence, a gap, a silence where one expects a name. It is as if they had already begun to vanish, not in battle, but in expectation. More curious still is the lack of burial evidence. Roman legions left behind cemeteries. Even in foreign lands, fallen soldiers were interred with ceremony, graves marked with stones bearing their name, rank, and years of service. But there is no mass grave for the Ninth, no battlefield ossuary, no indication of a large-scale loss of life tied to the Legion anywhere in northern Britannia. Some argue this supports the theory of reassignment
or quiet dissolution, but others find it suggestive, uncannily so, for even scattered veterans leave traces, and the ninth, for all their decades of service, seem to trail no such remnants behind them. It is as though the earth, like the archives, has chosen discretion. And yet, perhaps not all is gone. There are anomalies. In a valley northwest of York, a set of stone post holes was discovered, clearly the remains of a Roman marching fort, but no records indicate a detachment was ever stationed there. No supplies were ever documented traveling in that direction. The fort appears to have been occupied briefly, built quickly, abandoned quietly. Within the soil were found a few corroded nails, an iron spearhead, and a worn copper ring engraved with the Roman numeral 9. Too little to prove anything, too specific to ignore. Elsewhere, a carved stone fragment was unearthed bearing a partial Latin inscription. The letters are weathered but legible. Perille, silenti. They perished in silence. The rest is gone, eroded by centuries of frost and rain. Some suggest it refers to an unrelated event. Others are not so sure. The landscape of northern Britain is thick with such uncertainties. There are rings of stones, marked not with Druidic spirals, but with Roman survey cuts, suggesting attempts to map or claim sites long held sacred by the native tribes. Some believe the ninth ventured into these regions, seeking to extend Rome's grasp. Others believe they merely disturbed what should have been left alone. There are hills from which no artifacts emerge, places where even ground-penetrating radar returns little but static. Geologists chalk it up to mineral density, magnetic anomalies. But the locals, descendants of the land if not the tribes, say otherwise. They speak of cursed hills, of whispers beneath the earth, of lights in the peat fog, of men who marched into the highlands long ago and never returned. It would be easy to dismiss such tales, but we are Miskatonic, and we have learned that sometimes what lingers in folklore are not fictions, but the shadows of something unrecorded, something the stones remember, even when the scribes forget. What the Roman record fails to preserve, and what archaeology can only half reveal, may still echo in the stories of the land itself. For history, though so often written in Latin and carved in stone, also lives in the spaces between, passed by whisper and firelight, through mouths unlettered and minds unfettered by the disciplines of empire. The native peoples of northern Britannia, the Caledoni, the Votadini, the Selgovae, left behind few written traces. Their voices, when recorded at all, were filtered through Roman quills, and thus cannot be trusted entirely. Yet their stories endured in other forms. Across centuries, through Christian scribes, oral traditions, and finally into the collections of antiquarians, fragments remain, reassembled like shards of pottery unearthed after a storm. One such tale, recorded centuries later in a Highland monastic manuscript, tells of the Crimson Marchers,
faceless men in red tunics, iron helms, and silent sandals, who emerged from the mists, built strange fires, and vanished before the moon could rise. They were not described as warriors in the usual sense, but as something colder, detached, dreamlike. It is said they sang no songs, drank no ale, made no demands, only watched, as though taking measure of something. In a Hebridean variant, a group of hunters followed the footprints of these same marchers into a hollow between hills. There the air grew still, and the birds ceased to call. The ground was marked with dozens of deep impressions, boot prints, all identical in shape and depth, but there were no signs of a camp, no trail out, no sound but the wind. The footprints stopped in a ring of standing stones, and that night none of the hunters slept. Dismissed as folklore, these accounts nonetheless echo a familiar pattern. A group enters the north, is seen briefly in strange, silent formation, and then disappears. A simple story, easily dismissed, and yet it aligns with something deeper in the Celtic and Pictish imagination, that the land itself is not passive, that it holds memory, that it watches, and when stirred, responds. There are recurring motifs in northern mythology of the sleeping ones, of ancient armies beneath the hills, of voices heard beneath stones. A tradition common in both Irish and Scottish folk memory speaks of the hidden host, a lost force swallowed by the earth, doomed to march beneath it until the last of Rome's name is spoken aloud. In one Orkney fragment, they are said to surface once each century to walk beneath the aurora, still bearing standards no one living remembers. Now it is easy to romanticize these tales, too easy, and yet we must pause before discarding them entirely, for the Roman presence in Britain, while immense in infrastructure, left comparatively little cultural legacy in the far north. The walls were built, the roads were laid, and then, when Rome withdrew, the landscape returned to itself. It grew over stone, it folded in memory, but it did not forget. Some archaeologists and folklorists have noted how stories of the Ninth Legion may have merged with older tales, becoming part of the mythic stratum that defines the ancient British imagination. But that merging is not a dilution. It is perhaps an inheritance. Considered too the peculiar quiet in native traditions surrounding the Roman occupation. Unlike in Gaul or Germania, where local gods were absorbed, renamed, adapted into Roman pantheons, the northern Britons held firm. They kept their gods nameless, their sacred groves untouched, their hills unburned. And when Rome pushed too far north, the land, so the tales go, responded not with armies, but with withdrawal. Roads ended abruptly, forts were swallowed, patrols went too deep and did not return. The people did not resist, they waited, and in that waiting they remained unchanged. This passive resistance, so different from the open rebellion of Boudica or the southern tribes, may have been more effective in the long run. For while Rome built its wall, the north remained unconquered, not because it could not be taken, but because it refused to be known. One Highland poem, preserved only in oral form until the 19th century, speaks of a column of men with bronze in their mouth, who spoke only to the sky. They arrived, it is said, to measure the stars, but found the sky did not wish to be measured. One by one their fires went out. Now such imagery is surely poetic, symbolic rather than literal, but it hints at something vital, the feeling deeply rooted in northern lore that there are places not meant to be mapped, that some hills guard secrets not by power but by refusal. Perhaps the ninth, with all their discipline and training, walked into one of these secrets, and perhaps they never came out, not because they were slain, but because they were absorbed, not into battle, but into myth, into the fabric of a land that does not yield its depths to names nor numbers. We may never know what they found, but the stories remain, hovering just at the edge of sleep, where history becomes dream and stone becomes voice. Strange, is it not, that a force so thoroughly erased from the official scrolls of empire should thrive, centuries later, not in Roman records, but in the modern imagination? While the stone silence of history lingers, the Ninth Legion has become louder in legend with each passing age. Their disappearance, once a footnote in military scholarship, has rippled outward, becoming a canvas upon which poets, novelists, filmmakers, and dreamers have painted visions of mystery, loyalty, and loss. Their re-emergence begins not with archaeologists, but with storytellers. In the early 19th century, British antiquarians, already fascinated by Roman ruins and native lore, began to speculate more openly about the Ninth's fate. Lacking definitive evidence of their end, some historians proposed that the Legion was indeed destroyed in battle somewhere in the wilds of Caledonia. The theory spread quickly, becoming accepted truth in the minds of many. It was dramatic, tragic, and, importantly, unconfirmed. Such ambiguity was fertile ground for fiction. In the mid-20th century, the Ninth took on new life in the pages of Rosemary Sutcliffe's The Eagle of the Ninth, a novel that has shaped modern perceptions of the Legion more profoundly than any academic work. Published in the year 1954, Sutcliffe's story follows a young Roman officer in search of the lost eagle standard of the Ninth Legion, which in the novel's world had vanished beyond the northern frontier in disgrace. The novel is gentle in tone, but rich in atmosphere, filled with mist, wild hills, ancient rites, and a lingering tension between Roman order and native wildness. Sutcliffe's work does not claim to be historical truth. Rather, it is a mythic retelling, framed by the idea that what is missing demands to be found. The story resonated deeply, in part because the idea of a legion marching into the fog and never returning touches something primal. The notion that even the most disciplined, structured force can be unmade by a land it does not understand. Following Sutcliffe, other authors and filmmakers reimagine the Ninth in various forms. The Eagle, a cinematic adaptation released in 2011, portrayed the Legion's fall as a noble sacrifice and the mystery worth solving. Other films, such as Centurion, took a more visceral approach, offering blood-soaked speculations about betrayal, survival, and vengeance. In each case, history gave way to narrative. The ninth became a symbol, not of Rome's might, but of its limits. Beyond fiction, the Legion has become the subject of documentaries, speculative essays, and even alternative history games. In these tellings, the ninth often marches forever, an eternal army caught between worlds, between facts and fables. But why this fascination? Partly it is the magnetism of absence. We are drawn to what cannot be explained. In a world filled with data, with dates, with definitive ends, the unknown exerts a peculiar gravity. The ninth's vanishing is an invitation, a wound in the record that cannot be healed, only imagined. But there is something deeper. The ninth represents a kind of collective anxiety, the fear that even the most established systems can collapse without warning. That identity, when untethered from record, becomes vulnerable to the void. In a world dominated by control, the ninth is a reminder of the wilderness just beyond the light. It also feeds into a certain myth of the British landscape, the idea that the land remembers differently than the city does, that Rome may have built roads and walls, but the hills were never tamed. The moors, the lochs, the forests, they outlasted the empire. And in those places, time folds strangely. For British readers especially, the story of the ninth functions as an origin myth. It is not about Rome, but about the North. It is not about conquest, but about resistance. Not the defiant cry of rebellion, but the quieter strength of endurance. The tribes of Caledonia could not be broken. And if they consumed the legion whole, then perhaps they consumed a piece of Rome itself. And so the ninth returns, not as soldiers, but as shadows. Their story has become a ghost story, retold in every generation with new names, new endings, new terrain, but always the same question. What happened to the ninth? It is a question that will likely never be answered, not because the truth is lost, but because the absence has become more powerful than any fact. The ninth, by disappearing, achieved a kind of immortality. Their story survives because it was not recorded, but because it was not. In the end, they were not buried in stone. They were buried in story. And stories, as we at Miskatonic are well aware, are the oldest kind of ruin. In the formal language of history, absence is a deficit, a blank space in the record, a failure of preservation. We speak of gaps in knowledge, of lost sources, as though time were a thief and history a puzzle waiting to be reassembled. But here, within these vaulted lecture halls, beneath Miskatonic's own library, we are not always so eager to fill in the gaps. Some silences are structural, others are intentional, and a few are protective. The disappearance of the Ninth Legion has long tempted researchers to look further than they should, to speculate not just beyond the border of empire, but beyond the threshold of reason. What began as an academic inquiry into troop movement and logistics gradually becomes something else, a meditation on how knowledge fails when it meets the wild, and how the wild sometimes responds with silence. There is a concept known among our more metaphysically inclined scholars as deep forgetting. Not a failure to remember, but a kind of willful obscuration that reality itself imposes upon memory. It is not unique to Rome. Ancient civilizations across the world have names for it: the veil, the threshold, the forgetting tide. The idea that there are things which resist being known, not because they are hidden, but because they are incompatible with the structures we use to understand. The north of Britannia to Rome was not only a terrain problem, it was a cognitive one. The empire saw the world in terms of lines, provinces, and dominions. But the highlands, the moors, the standing stones, they did not submit to categorization. They whispered in a tongue that Latin could not translate. When the ninth vanished, it may have done so not only in body, but in language. Their names, their deeds, their paperwork, these may have simply ceased to function in the usual frameworks, as though the further they moved from the administrative center of the empire, the thinner their reality became, until it was no longer sustained. There is some precedent for this. Ancient texts, discovered in fragments across the Levant and Carthaginian ruins, speak of desert caravans that wandered off known routes and were unwritten, not killed, not forgotten, unwritten, removed from the logic of ledger and map. At Miskatonic, we take such fragments seriously. In one long-dismissed copy of the Itinerarium Antonini, held in our restricted collection, unearthed from a cellar near Aquileia during the Napoleonic looting of northern Italy, there is an addendum, unsigned, written in faint charcoal ink. Some roots end before their stones are laid. Do not follow what no longer recalls itself. It is not clear to what it refers, but the page is brittle with age, and there is a subtle warping in the parchment around the words, as though the ink had soaked not just into the surface, but beneath it. There are places where the discipline of history yields to the discretion of silence, where the purpose of inquiry is not to illuminate, but to recognize the limits of light. The ninth's disappearance may, in some essential sense, be precisely that, not a question waiting to be answered, but a boundary waiting to be observed. Their final march, if it occurred, may have taken them not into battle, but into stillness, into a region not hostile, but impervious, not defended by sword, but by structure, a land where names lose coherence, and paths do not echo footsteps. And in this stillness they remain, not dead, not buried, but misaligned, not lost, but unrecalled. At Miskatonic, we teach the importance of evidence, of documents, of stratigraphy and stone, but we also teach the discipline of restraint, the ability to admit softly and without shame that some endings are not ours to know. The ninth may yet be discovered, a mass grave unearthed, a tile found with the year etched in surviving ink. But until that day, we live with the silence. We walk alongside it. We recognize it not as failure, but as form. Not all stories are completed. Some are simply closed. While the last footsteps of the 9th faded into moss and mire, the city of Rome stood eternal, its columns uncracked, its archives vast, its forums still buzzing with petitions, decrees, and the polished voices of senators weaving their nation's memory in stone. But if you walk the marble halls of the Curia Julia in your mind, past the statues, past the engraved names of honored generals, past the gilded maps that stretch like spiderwebs over the known world, you will not find a word spoken for the 9th. No funerary monument, no eulogy etched in Latin, not even a muttered phrase in the surviving letters of imperial administrators. Their name simply stops. And that silence, far from accidental, deserves scrutiny, for it is not merely an omission, it is an act of power. In the ancient world, forgetting was not a passive event. It could be engineered. Damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory, was a formal Roman policy used to erase disgraced emperors or traitors from history. Statues were pulled down, names chiseled off inscriptions, scrolls altered or burned. To remove a name was to remove a life, and with it the claim to legacy. The 9th, as far as we know, were never officially damned, but they were, in another sense, discarded. And in that discarding we find a different expression of power, not wrathful erasure, but bureaucratic eclipse, quiet, bloodless, and total. Imagine the meeting rooms of the imperial bureaucracy, mosaicked floors, low ceilings filled with the scrape of styluses and the murmur of scribes. News arrives from Britannia. A legion under strength, lost contact, perhaps overrun, perhaps not. No clear messenger, no definitive report, only silence, delay, the absence of return. What decision is made? Perhaps none at first. Rome was accustomed to slow communication, to losses and confusion. But eventually, someone has to balance the books. A name must be struck from the payroll, a new cohort raised, a general promoted without the mention of a failed campaign. And in the process, the 9th becomes inconvenient. Not a tragedy to be memorialized, but an irregularity to be resolved. One can imagine a scroll altered, a name reassigned, a posting updated with vague language, transferred, integrated, retired, and then nothing more. The silence hardens into fact. The omission becomes precedent. Generations pass. The legion's name is no longer used. Its eagle, if lost, is never reclaimed. Its officers, if they survived, are absorbed elsewhere or quietly retired. This, too, was the power of Rome, to declare not only what was true, but what had been true, to control not merely lives, but legacies. And so the 9th, thousands of trained men who had served Rome across decades, become, in the capital's eyes, an accounting error. Not honored, not grieved, just unfound. This silence is made all the more striking by contrast, for when Rome wished to remember, it did so with fury and grandeur. The losses in the Teutoburg forest were inscribed into the empire's psyche for generations. Augustus himself is said to have wandered his palace, muttering, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." Statues were erected, campaigns launched in retribution, and the names of the lost, legions 17, 18, 19, were never reused out of sacred dread. But the 9th, Their loss is not mourned in any surviving imperial correspondence. No army was sent to reclaim them. No poetic lament survives. They were not renamed, not cursed, just allowed to fade. To the bureaucrats in Rome, it may have been easier this way. Britannia was always marginal, more costly to keep than to lose. Its wild tribes offered no riches, only resistance. Its weather ruined armor and soured grain. A disappearing legion so far from the eyes of the Senate was an acceptable inconvenience, a chapter skipped in the scroll. And so the 9th were unwritten. It is tempting to frame this as indifference, but at Miskatonic we consider another possibility, that silence in the right hands is a form of control. To name a disaster is to confront it. To record a loss is to bind it in time, to give it shape, to allow others to learn from it or mourn it. But to erase a loss, that is to make it unrepeatable, unknowable. It is to make it disappear not only from the page, but from the mind. And in this way, the empire preserved its illusion of dominion. The 9th, for all their years of service, for all their toil in the whetstone of the north, became not a lesson, but a liability. Rome did not fear death, but it feared disorder. And so the men of the 9th were quietly given to the mist, no trumpet, no inscription, no echo in the marble forums they once defended from afar.
In the year 122, the Emperor Hadrian arrived in Britannia. It was not a visit born of victory, but of fatigue. Rome's northernmost province had drained imperial coffers, demanded repeated military deployments, and offered no peace in return. The tribes of Caledonia remained unyielding. The land swallowed supply lines, and the Moors gave back little more than mist and resistance. Hadrian, unlike his predecessor Trajan, was not a man of conquest. He believed in consolidation, in fortification, in the shaping of empire through walls rather than swords. And so, during his visit to the island's cold spine, he issued an order that would define Roman Britain for the next 2 centuries. A wall. Not just a line of stone, but a physiological threshold. A statement that said, this far and no further. Hadrian's wall, stretching from the River Tyne to the Solway Firth, was more than a military barrier. It was a monument to restraint, a visual structural acknowledgement that Rome had reached its limit in this land of damp stone and restless tribes. The wall was not the result of victory, it was the result of decision, of ceasing to pursue what could not or should not be claimed. The construction of the wall marked a pivot in Roman policy, from aggression to endurance, from projection to permanence. And in this new schema, the fate of the 9th Legion no longer mattered. Their loss, if it had been one, did not align with the new narrative. They had belonged to an earlier mindset, an earlier Rome, one still convinced it could civilize the wilderness by force. But the Rome of Hadrian knew better, or at the very least it had grown more careful in how it interpreted loss. And so the 9th were excluded, not only from the roles and honors of Rome, but from its evolving vision of itself. They had marched too far, tried too much, and paid the price for a policy no longer in favor. The wall then became not just a border, but a burial, a sealing over, a monument less to Roman might than to imperial forgetting. Each stone laid in that massive northern barrier was an act of boundary making, not just geographical, but historical. It demarcated what Rome wished to remember and what it did not. Behind the wall, forts flourished, Vindolanda, Housesteads, Birdswold, all garrisoned by fresh legions, newer names. Trade resumed. Settlements took root. A new stability was projected, and the story of Roman Britain continued, cleaner, straighter, and emptied of the uncertainty that the ninth embodied. This was the genius of imperial systems, to erase mess not by censorship, but by supersession. A new chapter was written, not in contradiction to the old, but simply overtop it. The same lands were measured again, the same hills renamed, the same patrols rescheduled with different numbers. What had come before was not denied, it was buried beneath layers of administration, of new construction, of reissued maps. And in that burial, something strange occurs, because even as the ninth is forgotten by Rome, they become something else to those on the periphery. To the auxiliaries stationed along Hadrian's new frontier, the ninth becomes a whisper, a caution, a story shared around campfires. Don't stray too far into the hills, that's where the ninth went. To the tribes across the wall, the ninth becomes a legend, not of conquest, but of disappearance. Even their Rome couldn't save them. They marched, and they were taken. And to the settlers who lived in the shadow of the wall, those who traded, married, and buried their dead there, the ninth became a kind of echo. Not spoken often, but felt. A question left unanswered, embedded in the ground beneath them. This is how the ninth transformed from legion to law, not through official remembrance, but through strategic neglect. Rome, in forgetting them, gave them to the land, and the land, in its patient and eerie way, remembered them differently. We see this echoed in the very architecture of the wall. It is not uniform. Its construction varies, stone in some places, turf in others. The placement of mile castles and turrets is irregular, and there are places, odd, overlooked corners where the wall falters for no clear reason, where its stones shift in size or angle, as if the builders themselves encountered something they did not care to name. Local legends still persist in those regions, of patrols that walk the wall after dark, of armor heard clinking in empty watchtowers, of figures glimpsed through arrow slits, facing inward. All fanciful, no doubt, but perhaps not entirely without meaning. For in building a wall to mark the edge of empire, Hadrian also built a monument to forgetting. And yet forgetting is never perfect. There are always seams, hairline cracks in the marble narrative. Through those cracks, stories slip, and among those stories walks the ninth, still marching, still unrecorded, still present, just beyond the reach of Rome's memory, and perhaps just beyond ours. To lose a legion is no small thing. 5,000 men, give or take, each sworn to Rome, each trained to endure, to obey, to build and to bleed in equal measure. To lose them is to lose not only a military asset, but a projection of order, an extension of imperial identity. And yet Rome, so obsessed with image, so rigorous in its chronicling of victories and failures alike, allowed the ninth to vanish. Why? The answer, perhaps, is not found in battle reports
or archaeological surveys, but in the psychology of empire, in the quiet calculations made behind closed doors, in the shadows of senatorial chambers and the marble stillness of the Palatine Hill. Let us consider for a moment the men who ruled Rome in the early 2nd century, the emperors Trajan and Hadrian, and those who served beneath them. Their power was absolute, but their position precarious. Every edict, every campaign, every construction project was crafted not only for utility, but for perception. They lived under the constant gaze of the Senate, the army, the people, and, more subtly, the past. In the Roman mind, a successful emperor was a curator of legacy. Augustus had set the standard: peace through conquest, prosperity through control, memory through monument. And so every emperor who followed was measured against that marble yardstick. Trajan, conqueror of Dacia, embodied this ideal. He was expansionist, decisive, and widely respected. But beneath his celebrated campaigns lay logistical strain. The empire was vast, its borders frayed. Revolts simmered in Judea, in Mauritania, and yes, in Britannia. The disappearance of a legion during his reign would have been, at best, inconvenient, at worst, a crack in the facade. And so it was likely ignored, or rephrased, or deferred. Hadrian, who succeeded Trajan, was of a different mold. A man of thought and form, he traveled widely, not to conquer, but to survey. He favored fortification over expansion, diplomacy over dominion. And he, perhaps, more than any other emperor, understood the danger of admitting weakness. Hadrian's reign is defined not by conquest, but by containment, both geographic and ideological. He inherited the lingering messes of his predecessor and quietly began the work of restructuring the empire to be leaner, more sustainable. In doing so, he likely encountered the unfinished business of the 9th. Perhaps a dossier crossed his desk, a report from Britain, fragmentary, inconclusive, a legion dispatched north, no reply, uncertain fate. Hadrian, faced with this, had choices. He could send an expedition north to confirm or deny. He could publicize the loss, frame it as noble sacrifice, and rally fresh legions in response. He could build shrines, issue medals, stage remembrance. But he did none of these things. Instead, he built a wall, and the silence remained. For a Roman emperor, the control of narrative was as important as the control of land. And the 9th, in their uncertainty, posed a narrative risk. They represented not just military failure, but unknowability. They were not slain in glorious battle. They were not restructured or reassigned. They simply ceased. And that kind of loss, ambiguous, unresolved, has no place in the neat marble scrollwork of imperial legacy. Better, then, to allow their fate to fade, to turn the page without annotation, to file the report and never revisit it, to unknow. The political machinery of Rome was more than laws and legions. It was memory management. The emperors were not just rulers of territory. They were curators of certainty. and when faced with uncertainty, they preferred silence over explanation. It is no accident that in the same years Hadrian reshaped the physical border of the empire, he also reshaped its intellectual one. New histories were commissioned, old ones revised. Writers like Suetonius and Pliny the Younger walked the line between honesty and flattery. And in their pages we see not lies, but omissions, carefully placed, politely unexplained. It was a habit that would only grow. Later emperors would perfect this mode of forgetting. When things went wrong, plagues, defeats, economic collapse, their scribes recorded only the necessary. The rest was left to decay. This was not apathy, it was strategy. And the ninth, in their quiet disappearance, became a perfect candidate for strategic forgetting. No scandal, no mourning, just an unfinished sentence in the imperial narrative. Here at Miskatonic, we speak often of the dangers not just of what is unknown, but of what is made unknown, the deliberate shadow, the cultivated silence, the crack in the record that has been smoothed, not by time, but by intention. In such shadows, stories fester, and in such absences, new truths wait. Perhaps that is why the ninth remains compelling, not because they are lost, but because they were allowed to be. Because somewhere in the scroll vaults of a long-collapsed palace, a decision was made, not to explain, but to forget. And in that forgetting, they became more than soldiers. They became possibility. To speak of the Ninth Legion's disappearance is to speak, inevitably, of the deep psychology of empire. Not in the rhetoric of conquest or the cold math of strategy, but in the private voice Rome used when it spoke only to itself. The empire that conquered the Mediterranean, that paved mountains and drained marshes, that named the stars and mapped the moon's calendar, did not know how to lose, or rather, it could not admit that it had. Rome did not simply occupy land, it occupied meaning. It recast every defeat as delay, every failure as prelude. Its history, so vast and richly recorded, is also strangely hollow in places. The hollowness is not emptiness, it is scaffolding, constructed to support the appearance of certainty. And the ninth, whatever their true fate, fell into one of those voids. Here at Miskatonic, we've studied such voids not merely as historians, but as cartographers of absence. They are not accidental. They form patterns. They cluster along fault lines where belief falters, where power meets mystery, where knowledge turns brittle. Consider the years after the ninth fades from record. No scholar disputes that the empire endured, flourished even for a time. Hadrian's Wall was built, settlements stabilized, trade resumed. To the casual observer, nothing was lost. If a legion was gone, another took its place. But for those who look closely, a subtle shift is felt. Rome, after the disappearance of the ninth, grows quieter in its frontier language. The sweeping proclamations of total control give way to terms like leman, threshold. The borders become less about dominance and more about definition. Hadrian's Wall is no longer a spear,
It is a shelf, a place where Rome sets its burdens down. And perhaps that is why the ninth had to be forgotten. They were not just a loss, they were a reminder of ambition overreached, of order unraveling, of something beyond the empire's ability to translate. And so the silence was a kind of insulation. The great cities of the empire, Ephesus, Antioch, Rome itself, continued to thrive. The baths steamed, the forums echoed, the scrolls multiplied. But in each of these spaces, a kind of brittle calm began to root, a sense that the world was no longer being conquered, but being managed. Denial in this context was not a weakness, it was a tactic. To preserve the image of invincibility, Rome learned to unsee the things that threatened it. Unrecorded border skirmishes, quiet famines, dissension whispered in the barracks of distant legions, a vanishing, an erasure, a myth, a shrug. And in that shrinking inward, politically, philosophically, Rome sowed the seeds of its own long decay. For while silence may contain the immediate shock of loss, it does not erase the reality. The ninth still haunted the frontier, if not in name, then in tension. Their absence was a tear in the map, not visible perhaps, but felt, a subtle slippage beneath the marble weight of certainty. And slowly other slippages followed. Over time, legions elsewhere would be overrun, provinces lost, borders abandoned, and each time Rome chose the same response: to retreat without acknowledgement, to rewrite the ledger, to reassign the name, to remove the plaque, always forward-facing, never downward-looking, until at last there was nowhere left to look but down. This is not to say that the erasure of the ninth caused the empire's fall, but it illustrates the pattern, the refusal to engage with contradiction, the preference for illusion over reckoning, the belief that what is not written cannot weigh upon the world, but it does, and the ninth is proof. Even now, centuries beyond the fall of empire, they stir in our collective imagination, not as ghosts, not as martyrs, but as echoes, echoes of a silence too precise to be natural, or forgetting too complete to be accidental. We remember them precisely because Rome did not. In that omission, they became more real. In that silence, they became a question without a mark. And questions, as any scholar here at Miskatonic knows, do not vanish when ignored. They deepen, they darken, they wait.
And now, as the lanterns gutter low, and the marble hush of these vaults deepens, we bring our attention away from the maps and stones. The scrolls can be rolled, the wax tablets returned to their drawers. The echoes of the ninth, well, they will wait. What remains in the end is not the legion's fate, not the number of men, not the exact coordinates of a battlefield that may never have been, not the bureaucratic entry that once marked them as deployed and then marked nothing at all. What remains is the feeling, the hush at the edge of empire, the damp wind that moves against a column's rhythm,
the road that ends too soon, the stone that was never engraved. We imagine them now, somewhere in the north, beneath a sky thick with cloud, the ground spongy with moss, the torches gutter, the command is given, they march forward into fog, and the fog does not give them back. History has taught us to search for answers, but here in the quiet study holes of Miskatonic, we learn something else, to sit with the question, to dwell not in resolution, but in resonance. For not all truths are clarifying. Some are softening. Some make room for sleep. Perhaps it is better this way. Perhaps the ninth, lost beyond the wall, remains there, forever on patrol, forever stationed at the threshold between the known and the unknowable, not defeated, not triumphant, but held in the stillness of story. And so, let them remain. Not everything need return. Let their boots echo into the hills. Let their names melt into the rain-slicked stone. Let their memory, quiet, half-formed, settle like a woolen cloak over your shoulders, warm despite the chill. And if you still hear them, marching softly through your dreams, know this: you have not failed to sleep. You have simply wandered a little too far north. Good night, scholar. Rest easy, for the empire holds, if only for tonight.